Okay, everybody, welcome to Gold Dome 2021.
Hello and welcome to the Atlanta Press Club. My name is Christy Wooten. I'm president of the club. Thank you for joining us today for our online series, the Loudermilk Young Series event, Gold Dome 2021. Today we welcome some of Atlanta's top journalists who will be discussing the current Georgia legislative session, and they're here to take your questions as well. So if you want to get your question in, go ahead and do that in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we will be getting to those later in the hour. Thank you for supporting the work of the Atlanta Press Club. Journalism has never been under attack more than it is right now, so we appreciate your support. And just by being here, you're supporting us. But you can also visit atlantapressclub.org to register for our upcoming events, including the February 10th discussion, The Future of Democracy Now!, featuring Carter Center CEO Paige Alexander and other experts from Emory University's Political Science Department. So don't miss that. You can register for that on our website. You may also sponsor an event, join as a member, and donate to the club there. Also today, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube to watch our videos and learn more about the club. All right, let's get started. Today, we've asked Archit Seshadri to moderate the program. Archit is Atlanta Bureau Chief for Nexstar Media Group that serves 4 stations that represent 45 counties across Georgia. Archit covers state government, healthcare, education, cybersecurity, economic impacts, and entertainment. Everybody, please welcome Archit.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Press Club for this amazing panel and all of our fellow journalists who are taking some time off from the state capitol, but we're still putting them to work. We appreciate all of you guys joining in. Thank you again to everybody for making time. Let's get started right now for Welcome to Gold Dome 2021. Yes, hard to believe we are in a new year and their legislative session is back. When I was at the Capitol, I was like, I just feel like we were just here last year. And now we're back with masks and trying to be socially distant. So it's a new year with some new rules. So throughout 2020, of course, we know about that not only here in Georgia, but across the country. The Georgia's electoral process took center stage in the media. It came to both the presidential race as well as the Senate runoff, sort of Georgia front and center when it came to the election process. Well, that certainly hasn't dimmed, and now lawmakers are back at the state capitol, putting together policies in place and determining the next steps forward. The current Georgia State legislative session kicked off about 4 weeks back, January the 11th. And here today, we are here to discuss some of those issues that lawmakers will discuss over the next 40 or so legislative days. We're about 1/4 done, which will probably run until the end of March or early April. So some of those topics that lawmakers have on their agenda include, of course, ratifying the budget. That is the only thing they're required to do constitutionally. But of course, proposed bills, both on the House side and the Senate side. And you guessed it, if you're wondering what some of those topics are, well, certainly healthcare, COVID-19, and vaccines dominating those headlines. Of course, healthcare, rural internet and broadband, schools and education, jobs, the economy, other topics as well, including gambling, casinos, infrastructure and logistics, also appearing this time. So to get a perspective on all of those discussions, those challenges, those issues, we're joined by an esteemed panel of journalists. You may have seen them or read their articles or seen their stories. So let's introduce our panelists right now. We have Stan Dunlap. He is a state government reporter for the Georgia Recorder. Stan, please wave. We also have Stephen Fowler, political reporter for Georgia Public Broadcasting. GPB has done a lot of investigative reporting and apparently also plays the guitar, which we did not know. Maybe he'll strum some tunes for us. And last but certainly not least, we have Emma Hurt, political reporter for WABE News, who has been front and center at the Capitol and is in fact taking a little break. Instead of having lunch, he's joining us now to discuss some of those election issues. Emma, Stephen, and Stan, thank you all for joining us and giving us your perspectives. To start off, I'd like to ask our panelists the most basic question that's on everyone's mind, the experience of reporting from the state capitol now. Certainly things are different. We've changed in the way we walk in, where the media is staged. How are you noticing a difference, if any, perhaps, besides the masks in 2021? We'll start with Stan.
Well, I think what we're seeing now, and it does tie into the masks, twice a week testing for legislators and their staff. And so we're seeing standards or protocols that are in place, and that we're seeing that for the most part, they're being followed. I think last year, even when they came back from the suspended session, that it wasn't consistent mask wearing among legislators, even in the chamber. I think now we've seen people were taking it more seriously. We've seen the House Speaker Ralston talk about how he's lost some close people to him, and so we're seeing the protocols that are in place outside of a few instances are followed much more consistently. And I think that's probably making a little bit of a difference, or quite a bit of a difference this time, at least in the comfort. And also just around the Capitol since the pandemic, you see a lot fewer people, that the lobbyists and advocates that normally just fill the hallway. That it's a much smaller crowd. They limit, who comes in and out of the chamber. Even on my side, I covered the Senate quite often, and the press, normally we would be down on the chamber floor, and now we're up at the gallery, top gallery, spread out. So I think you're seeing a lot more protocols, requirements, and legislators that are following some of the new guidelines as well. But it's definitely shifted everything from more virtual meetings to and you're getting more updates from what's happening with the testing. So for instance, in the House, they will give an update every so often, but the Senate will actually let you know when there's a positive test. And so I just think it's taken much more seriously than it has been.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's same question to Emma. Emma, I know we didn't see each other at the Capitol, and obviously different, not on the floor this time, a little bit above, and sort of an aerial view in terms of safety and protocols and testing. Do you feel like this is enough? Are you comfortable with the way it is, or were you surprised at the sheer volume of people when we walk into the Capitol?
I think compared to over the summer when we had our sort of first real taste of pandemic lawmaking, this is a lot better. There's just more understanding and acceptance of mask usage. So that goes a long way, as we all know. But I also think that all of us have adapted the ways we're reporting. I mean, Stephen, it looks like you're at home. I think, Stan, are you at home or at the Capitol?
I'm at our downtown office.
Okay. But I mean, I think we all are kind of avoiding the Capitol a little bit wherever possible, just to try to avoid, which is so strange. It's so antithetical to our job, which is to always be in the middle of it. So that's been weird. But, with cell phones and email and live streaming, we can stay on top of things a bit. But I think it's really changed our reporting processes and the access that we have to lawmakers. And I don't necessarily fault them for the protocols that they've put in place to try to protect lawmakers and protect us. But it does make it a little bit harder to track people down and to find people, whereas normally, everyone's right there at your fingertips and you can kind of grab them off the floor, see someone in the hallway, and there's just fewer people in the hallways, as Stan said, and it's harder to find lawmakers. So it is making it a little more difficult, but I don't know. It's a necessary evil for all of us. Everybody misses 1 year ago. I think that's for sure.
Absolutely. And Stephen, sort of to piggyback on what Emma and Stan were talking about, we're both on the Senate side mostly, but with the House, and sometimes when you talk about social distancing, yes, there is the rule about wearing the mask, and we see the signs and we see the testing on the floor. At least on the House side, have you seen that? Is it possible for the media, members of the media, to socially distance, or how is that sort of being worked out given the conditions that we're in right now?
Right. So, the House has a lot more members, and they're spread out among the floor, the gallery, and room 341. And luckily, they updated how some of the voting process works, where they all have their own tablets instead of last year's iteration where they had this painfully slow roll call vote process. But there are a lot more people that cover the House than the Senate. It's the bigger chamber. There's more spaces, but it's not really the same. There is some social distancing. There's some people, I don't go in every day unless I have to, just because of the amount of people and the kind of stakes of what it would be like to bring the virus home to family members and things. But I think the other thing that you see beyond just the logistics of things is that the pace of the session has moved a lot differently than maybe years past. There's a little bit more urgency with getting the amended fiscal year budget done and working on the next fiscal year budget. There's not as many of the trappings of the doctor of the day and honoring various and sundry Georgians. And it's kind of a little bit more focus on just lawmaking, which is kind of nice from the perspective of having to keep track of all the bills and both chambers and committee meetings and stuff. And I think, the House and Senate press office and the leadership of those chambers have done a lot to make things more accessible to people at home, but also members of the media that may or may not be able to cram into a tight committee room every hour for 6 hours, 4 days a week. So it's definitely different. I think I've enjoyed it a little bit more from the sense that when I am at home, I've got multiple computers and I can watch the House on one screen, the Senate on the other. I can record things more easily and can kind of keep track of everything that's going on a little bit better. But, I haven't really been able to get in touch with some lawmakers at times because I can't just go and grab them from the floor. And when you've got things like controversial voting bills coming out and other things where you really need to hear from somebody face to face to get their perspective, it's been a little bit hard.
You bring up a good point and a great transition point to the next question I was going to ask you guys about the legislation when it comes to voting. Certainly we saw that last year, the state flipping blue, not only in the presidential race, but also in the Senate runoffs back in January. We also heard about the Senate Republicans trying to unveil some bills to make it harder to vote. Where do we stand on these bills? Georgia, blue. At the state legislature, both sides are red. Do we see voting and election laws and rules changing given what we saw from previous President Donald Trump and some of the issues that we saw last year with the Secretary of State and sort of this back and forth about voter integrity and election fraud? We'll start with you, Stephen.
There are definitely going to be changes to voting this year. How extreme they are, if you would have asked me a month or two ago, I would say that there's a lot more on the table, but now it seems like things have kind of calmed down a bit. There were 8 bills dropped this week with support of Senate leadership, doing everything from eliminating no excuse absentee voting to getting rid of drop boxes to getting rid of the state's motor voter law that is responsible for over 5 million of the 7.6 million voter registrations that we have. But only one of those I see has a realistic chance of getting through, and it's one that has 26 co-sponsors that would add an ID requirement to absentee ballot applications. You would either have to fill out your driver's license number or send in a photocopy of a voter ID that you'd have to show when you go to the polls in person. And it's also codifies what the state election board introduced last year, which is an online absentee registration portal. So that's something that provides a little bit more security to ensure that, the person requesting a ballot is that person, but it also isn't something that's just completely out in left field of where the voting machines and voting system already is. I've been told that the actual bill that the Senate Republicans are going to rally behind and try to push through hasn't yet been filed, and I have no idea what could be in it, but the Senate has been the ground zero for kind of pushing a lot of claims of election fraud and just lies and misinformation about how voting works. So they're going to be taking the more extreme position on voting. Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan has pushed back on those things. He rebuked 3 senators who were kind of the ringleaders of that action and stripped them of committee assignments, in part because of the election fraud, but also because of some internal politics about who the speaker pro tem would be. And so I don't necessarily expect things to go far. Over in the House, Speaker David Ralston said he doesn't support getting rid of no excuse absentee voting and does support adding some sort of ID requirement. And the other thing I'm interested in the House is a bipartisan voting bill that probably is going to pass that would shorten the runoff period in Georgia, sort of, by giving military and overseas voters a ranked choice instant runoff ballot. So for the November election, those voters would get the November ballot and then this ranked choice instant runoff ballot where they would have to rank their choices if that race went to a runoff. So we could have had the January 5th runoff for the 2 Senate races in Public Service Commission in December, in early December, if this law would have been in effect. And it's one of those things that really gets into the weeds of election administration and kind of tweaking things that isn't quite as flashy or controversial as signature matching or new voting machines or absentee ballot rejections, but it's the type of legislation that would actually end up changing things, probably for the better, with voting laws, that comes from a place of lawmakers actually doing their homework instead of watching conspiracy theories on YouTube.
Stan, let's follow up with you. Thank you, Stephen, for that update. I was going to say, with the senators throwing the absentee voting bills, we also read about the 1.3 million people or so that cast their ballots absentee back in November. And if Senate Bill 71 does become law, it would disqualify a third of those. You did some reporting on that. Can you elaborate a little bit about some of how these potential bills, if they became law, could impact voters in Georgia?
Well, and that's when you said a third, it may actually be more than that. Well, one of the significant changes in that is they changed the age for getting the absentee ballots from 65 to 75, and you're also cutting off. We know, I think everybody it's on the panel or that's listening right now either voted absentee maybe or at least know someone that voted absentee. And if that law changes, it's a process that is new for a lot of people, but I think a lot of people became comfortable with it because of the pandemic. And so if there is some kind of legislation that does try to curb that, I think you'll get a lot of backlash. And even if the Senate Republicans who somehow do get that through, I think on the House side, it probably would get nixed. House Speaker Ralston, and even Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan and Governor Kemp have all supported a photo ID requirement for absentee ballots, but they've all said they don't have the appetite for actually ending the no excuse absentee ballot system. But yeah, it would have a pretty significant impact, especially since we had the record numbers, not just 1.3 million in the November election, but three plus million between the primary, the general, and then the runoffs. And so I think that's probably going to be a new norm, that even when things return normal and we're out of this pandemic, a lot of people will still be using the no excuse system if it is still in place. But and then Stephen mentioned too the other extreme measure, which is to end the opt-out for the driver's license. You go in to the DMV, you get a license, and it automatically has the box checked for you to get your voter registration. This bill would make it where you would have to be proactive and check that box. And that's another bill that probably is a long shot one, but it would have a significant impact because, and especially when you think about young voters, people who are just now turning 18 and or maybe getting their first license, and maybe they get that voter registration for the voter registration card in the mail, and maybe they go out and decide to vote because of that. So those are bills that could have some significant impacts if they do occur, but I think it's those are more extreme and are going to have a much more difficult chance of passing.
I would.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to turn to you next.
Yeah, I was just going to add it. I think a lot of what happens down here, even though maybe it doesn't show up in all the headlines, is that a lot of what happens is bipartisan. A lot of what happens down here is unanimous. But this is one issue that is not going to be, and it's going to really suck up a lot of the political oxygen in the room. It already is, because it really cuts at the core of both parties right now. Democrats have made voting access such an important part of their platform, really politically. Stacey Abrams made it such a big part of her campaign and her advocacy since then. And Republicans, we're already talking about it, but the November election and the claims about voter fraud have really put them in a political corner where they have to do something to appease their voters who really don't feel good about the security of our voting system. And so it's, something's going to happen, as Stephen said. That I think that's a safe bet, just because the pressure is so high. But at every step, Democrats are going to be fighting it with all that they can. And so while it might get a lot of the headlines, it will be the major likely partisan battle that we see here. Remember, there are other things that are going to happen that are going to be bipartisan, but this is not going to be it.
And sort of sticking with that, sort of the dynamics with former President Donald Trump, there was a lot of time in Georgia talking about the voter issues, the election issues, integrity. In fact, I asked Gabriel Sterling, the voting implementation manager, do you think if the senators, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue did lose, that Trump had a role or the biggest role in that? I sort of want to throw this out to all of you guys. Do you think that, to what extent will the GOP's repositioning here in Georgia play out in the years to come, 2022 next year, and then in the years forward? Because we saw sort of the shift in dynamic between the Secretary of State and Governor Kemp and sort of that rhetoric back and forth. And it looked like the Democrats really didn't have to do anything and just take a back seat and be like, let's watch this unfold. How would the GOP would have to position themselves when it comes to associating themselves with former President Donald Trump? Emma, I don't know if you want to take a jab at that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we are seeing here at the state capitol, which, as you mentioned, is still very much controlled by Republicans, is the beginning of Republicans trying to sort out how to keep control of the state. You know, they had these massive losses in the presidential and the Senate races. While they had gains further down the ballot, you know, it does put the pressure on to maybe rethink strategy. And you've seen Speaker Ralston kind of come out and say that overtly, that you know, the kinds of proposals that we've passed in the House, like paid parental leave, even though that didn't, you know, ultimately pass in the Senate, maternal mortality, hate crimes legislation, these kind of more centrist issues that might get bipartisan support are things that he sees as important for Republicans to keep control of the state as it's now very much competitive and purple. And so while we're controlled by Republicans down here at the state capitol, we're seeing among Republicans, you know, above the surface and under the surface, the tension between, you know, how are we going to keep control? And you have some wing of the party that is going to push for things like getting rid of absentee ballot drop boxes to appease some voters who really believe that. But then what's the political risk to that on a larger sense when Georgia's a competitive state? Are you going to lose voters in the middle when you pass things like that? So that's what's interesting about covering the session right now, is that we are watching, we're watching Republican strategy maybe evolve and kind of shift a little bit.
I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit, just in the interest of time, since we have about 40 minutes or so, and shift to the other big elephant in the room, certainly coronavirus and COVID relief. We'll start with Stan. The impacts of COVID-19, obviously this was something that is new and was not even remotely talked about last year. The session did abruptly end, but when it comes to the impacts in terms of relief efforts, to what extent do you think that is going to dominate the budget, if given some of the other pieces of the puzzle? There's obviously healthcare, there's education, there's the economy, but when it comes to COVID relief, not just here in Atlanta, but in other communities, smaller cities and towns, where do you think those discussions are going to continue over the next 30 or so legislative days?
Well, I think the big, what will be interesting to see is how much money the Department of Health gets. The state has relied really on federal money to deal with the pandemic. And now that they're rolling out the vaccines and there's understaffed, overworked, how much money will they get and how much support and resources will the state provide? We've seen where they've talked about amending the budget to add a deputy commissioner to help out with Dr. Toomey, and that, you know, just things like that, where you give support to the people who are actually out there working to handle the pandemic and vaccinate the public. But in general, I think it's going to be interesting to see how much money gets poured into it. They need to update their online system as well, which will hopefully improve the vaccine distribution, depending on how quickly that can be done. But that'll be that's one of the key issues dealing with the pandemic as well. But I think that'll be one of the main things to watch, is when this new budget goes through the House and Senate, how much more money is there allotted for the Department of Health so they can continue dealing with this pandemic.
And sticking with that, Stephen, I'll go to you next when it comes to COVID relief and sort of the vaccine rollout. You know, Georgia, when it came to shutting down, sort of lost at the end of the spectrum. When it came to testing, we were at the bottom. When it comes to vaccine, again, it doesn't seem like we've made as much progress as perhaps other states that we've been seeing. Who takes that? What could have been done differently, or what could have been done differently, knowing that we had almost a year prepping for this vaccine rollout, given that we're only at about 150,000 or so doses a week for a state of 11 million people? Is that state lawmakers, or is that sort of up to the federal government because they haven't given those supplies?
Well, I think it's a combination. Georgia, there's only so much vaccine that Georgia gets a week, and that's something beyond their control. The goal is to get as many shots in arms as possible of that allocation that's coming out. I mean, I think there have been, in addition to the limited supply, there has been an overwhelming demand, and we're just in the first category of people able to get the vaccine. And so it's something that really is equally federal and state oriented. I think another thing you have to remember is the way that Georgia has structured its state government to be on the lighter and leaner side, and really to not be a top-down ogre. I think as Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger said once about how that office runs. But I mean, you look at the Department of Public Health, there is the state office, then there are 19 public health districts, then you've got 159 county health boards. And that level of bureaucracy and administration and funding and resources is diffused a whole lot more and spread out a whole lot more because, you know, for every, you know, small rural county you have in Georgia, you've got, you know, there are about 30 to 40 counties that you could combine all their population together and get one metro county. But they each have their own health board and they each have their own allocations and they each have their own challenges to getting things out in the community with different populations. And so, you know, Georgia has one of the more complex systems of federal, state, and local government interaction to deal with when it comes to the pandemic and a lot of other issues. And I think that's why you see so much consternation about the budget and why that money has been added into the Department of Public Health to facilitate out the resources. But, you know, this is the result of a, you know, years long, maybe decades long trend of Georgia really having a smaller government despite a very growing population. And when you look at how this pandemic is being handled, you know, you have to realize that, you know, population wise, Georgia has more than 10 million people, but that's spread around 159 counties. Whereas some of the other states that have been a little bit more efficient with getting the vaccine out and distributing things have fewer hurdles, administrative hurdles or resource hurdles or things like that. But the other thing I would say about the budget is that lawmakers expected a pretty steep drop because of the COVID pandemic. They were prepared to take hundreds of millions out of the state's rainy day fund to make ends meet. And now that they've come back and the economy's done better, that's where you see that money that's been able to add in back to the public health department because revenues were better than expected.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Emma, I want to jump to you real quick. I talked to a lawmaker, Nana Arok, and she said this is why lawmakers have been pushing and fighting for getting the health department funded more, not waiting for something like a pandemic, a global pandemic. And she brought up a great point saying that this is Georgia. We have the CDC, the federal agency, and to see this sort of time and time again, minus the distribution from federal, could the plans have been better executed or a better rollout? Because even now people are complaining about vaccine appointments, websites, and others trying to game the system. What are you hearing, or what do you think could have been done better for a better or smoother rollout when it comes to vaccines?
Well, look, and Democrats have a lot, have their arguments to complain about how Republicans handle this. And I think that, you know, I asked Governor Kemp about this, about the Department of Public Health, and is there need for larger, you know, a larger increase in funding going forward? Is there need for, you know, a big change to the department? And he said, yes. And he committed to an overhaul. He called the department antiquated and neglected. But he said, this year is not the year. In a pandemic response, we don't want to shake things up for them too much so that they can't function. And so, you know, something to come. But I will point out, and I have a friend who's an epidemiologist who said at least everybody now is looking at public health funding. I mean, it's something that we're all asking about. It's something we're talking about. Whereas last year, I don't remember if we talked about it, but now it's the number one question I have for budget writers. And I just asked Senator Tillery, the Senate chairman, who's, you know, he's working through the amended budget right now. And he said, we are looking for ways to add money into the Department of Public Health. So we'll, you know, expecting to see a little bit even more that the Senate has been able to find. So it's brought a lot of awareness for sure. Not a lot of willingness right now to make any big structural changes, obviously, but we'll see, and we'll all certainly be asking and holding them accountable to their commitments in the future.
And a great point there, both of you. I actually have a couple of questions from the audience as well. So if you have a question from the chat, we're going to open that up in about 15 minutes. We have some other questions minus COVID and voting about gambling and legalizing sports betting. So we'll get to that just in a minute with our panelists. But I want to go to Stan and talk to you about rural healthcare. As Emma just pointed out, we talked about that before, some of the hospitals closing, but with the pandemic and all that's happened, do we think that this could now sort of be the catalyst that pushes lawmakers for funding for rural hospitals so that they don't close, and having those issues that perhaps were on the back burner in previous legislative sessions that now could see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel?
That's a big question. We anybody that's watched or heard legislators talk about, Atlanta gets a lot of the attention, and it's represents such a large population center, but rural Georgia accounts for a significant portion of the population as well. And we know that the rural healthcare has been woefully inadequate for a while now, with hospitals closing. And so I know that, for instance, the House Budget Writer Terry England and quite a few other leaders have been outspoken in trying to find money or ways to help support rural healthcare. But it'll be interesting to see what will come up, what legislation gets dropped this session, and what actually has a chance of getting passed that maybe could have a significant improvement. But I think that's on the minds, and I think even because of the pandemic, it'll get a little bit more attention. But I think that's even without the pandemic, that's a sore need that needs to be addressed in the state. And so it'll come up. It'll be interesting to see what bills do get dropped this session that deal with that.
And Stephen, let me go to you next. When it comes to schools and reopening of schools and this sort of transition of going back to the classroom, certainly we've heard about Cobb County and the concerning the protests that many teachers have written to the school superintendent and Governor Kemp saying that teachers need to be vaccinated. And this is something that should not be in phase 1B or 1C or whatever the phase they're going to be in, but you're sort of at that dilemma that we see. And we know Governor Kemp was in Cobb County earlier on this morning, and we're about more than 1 million now Georgians vaccinated. It's still 10% or so, right? So when it comes to the school systems, where do we think that's going to sort of shape up with lawmakers balancing teacher budgets, teacher salaries and bonuses and retention versus keeping students and teachers safe? Because those are two separate issues, but now they're sort of merging together given COVID-19.
Right. So education has always been Governor Kemp's top priorities. This is actually the first year that he didn't try to push money in the budget to give teachers $2,000 pay raises because of the budget. And when you see, the budget was cut by about 10% last year because of the COVID pandemic, anticipating lower revenues. And when we had the money come back with the amended fiscal year budget, we saw that most of the money that was added back in went back to education, because Georgia lawmakers and the governor value education as one of the top priorities, and it's one of the biggest parts of the state's budget. So you are seeing education served in that regards. Governor Kemp just announced a teacher pipeline proposal yesterday that would allow retired teachers to get back into the game and help things out. And so, I mean, education is one of those areas that does dominate a lot of the discussion when it comes to funding and when it comes to legislation and figuring out what to do. But, the governor's office has also pointed out in regards to vaccine distribution and things, their stance is, if you want teachers to be vaccinated, who do you send to the back of the line? And, it's a somewhat provocative way of making this point that, we still have a limited number of vaccines. We still have county health boards and vaccination sites overwhelmed with people that are interested, that are in this 1A category, and that for the time being, we're not getting more than we already have planned for. And so it's just a really difficult, unfortunate position to be in, because, I don't think you'll find any lawmaker on either side of the aisle that's like, we don't want teachers back in school, we don't want school back to normal, we don't want teachers vaccinated. But the reality of the situation is that this is what we're working with for the foreseeable future. And so that's why at the very least we're seeing more money going back into education, because that's something that can be controlled and can be legislated and can be dealt with.
And real quick, before we sort of wrap up our COVID-19 segment, if anybody else wants to chime in about anything with COVID-19 relief or healthcare legislation, the floor is all yours. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next topic before we open up.
And on that, Kemp, recently set aside $76 million to implement his healthcare plan. That's just recently got federal approval, but there's also a state will fund a reinsurance program designed to lower insurance premiums across the state, and it's especially in rural Georgia. So that's something that, at least on that end, that maybe will help lower the premium across the state and maybe help out some Georgians that way. But that's one piece of healthcare related to Kemp. But and then Democrats, of course, have continued to say that that's still well short of what's needed as far as Medicaid expansion, and that probably isn't going to happen, of course, but with the Republican leadership being against it. But I think that it's important to note that there is at least some concerted efforts to try to address some of the rural healthcare issues in the state.
Absolutely. In fact, I think I just saw an alert from the CDC earlier on today saying that teachers can enter back without the vaccination. So there's been sort of that back and forth. So we'll just have to wait and see how all that sort of unfolds. Moving on, just in the interest of time, we have about 20 minutes or so. Let's go to Emma and talk about some of the other questions that have come in, minus COVID relief, minus elections and voting. Of course, there are other issues that are coming up. One question that has come up time and time again is the issue of sports betting and gambling. From your chatter with some of the lawmakers, either this session or in previous sessions, the likelihood that that'll even make it or get the attention this session, given all the other big pieces of the pie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's come up again and again and again. I think it's like 7 years that casino gambling has been tried. Sports betting
Right.
is newer. But we've got a bit of a delineation here this session where sports betting, the Supreme Court made a decision a couple of years ago that seems to clear the way legally for it. And so it's just a regular bill that they would need to pass. So simple majority. And, what I'm hearing is that could be something that could get done, that is comparable because it's already happening, right? It's just not getting regulated by the state and they're not collecting tax revenue on it. So seems kind of like a bipartisan issue that maybe we should collect tax revenue on this thing that's already happening because the Supreme Court has cleared the way for it. But then casino gambling and horse racing, those require constitutional amendments. So that's a 2/3 majority. That would be a referendum, on all Georgians' ballots. The governor can't veto that. And so that is a heavier lift. That's why it's taken so long. There's a lot of pushback, from people who make moral arguments about gambling, but the economic development arguments are strong. I'm hearing that there's so many lobbyists who are employed by by clients who are interested in gambling. And so there's going to be a push, but the question is just with the oxygen being sucked up by election reform and, COVID and the budget, will there be enough political will to get it done? And that's the question. Every year, there are going to be people that try. At this point, sports betting is looking reasonable, likely, possible. Choose your word. Everything could change on a dime. Stan and Stephen, correct me if you're hearing things differently. But casino gambling and horse racing, those are bigger lifts. So who knows on those?
Well, we'll have to just take our bets on it, right? To see if that happens or not. No pun intended. Frank May, thank you. That was a question from Frank May. I'm going to try to get to some more of these questions from those of you attending, and if we appreciate them, feel free to drop them in the chat window. The next question I wanted to talk to, this is either for Stan or Stephen, about rural broadband and rural internet. That's something that Lieutenant Governor has sort of addressed time and time again, making Georgia the technology capital south of the, really pushing that forward to bring jobs. Again, that is an economic sort of effort. How much of that, or the likelihood of those type of things getting more of an attention this session?
What we've seen just in the amended budget and for the upcoming budget, I think about $30 million for rural broadband that's been added. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. Earlier today, one of the senators was talking about it, the investment between private and state funding and with the local funding to really shore up and bring rural broadband up to what you would get around, a lot of parts of metropolitan areas. It's about $1 billion. So this is something that's a long-term process. And while the $30 million is a start, it's not going to, barely put a dent, but that's one area where you do see both Republicans and Democrats both wanting to address that, because as we saw with the pandemic and schools going to virtual learning, if you don't have adequate internet or speeds, then your child's just getting left behind. And so I do think that's something that's come up, and it's already have some money that's been invested in that, but it's still going to be a long process. And we're seeing EMCs and working with telephone companies to try to start laying some developing plans for fiber optics and broadband development too as well. And so I think that'll be some significant steps, but it's going to be a long-term process that'll play out well beyond this year.
Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that with regards to that, but I want to actually jump. We've actually pretty much covered a lot of topics, and I'm happy to get some more of these questions that are coming in. One thing that's come up, and I've seen this on Twitter as well, the social media chat about home evictions and things with, are there any proposed bills that might be coming up to address some of those situations that with COVID-19, the moratorium that was shifted? Any takers on that one?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any imminent bills at this time that are on that, but Stephen or Emma.
And we're just putting them on the spot too, so it's okay. They're
Yeah.
experts, but they're not experts on
There's
everything.
probably a bill like in the hopper right now that
Exactly.
we don't know about, but
And switching gears, I know we've all sort of like COVID fatigue or Zoom fatigue and now election fatigue. It's hard to think about 2022 is not that far out. Yes, it's next year, but when it comes to a potential gubernatorial potential runoff between Governor Kemp and maybe Stacey Abrams, even though she hasn't officially said she's running, I've asked her, I'm sure many of you guys have asked her or had those conversations. Where do we think that's going to happen? And I want to use this question to ask somebody a question from our audience. Someone says, Matt Towery, I'm wondering if anyone has any kind of insight or have heard rumblings from the Republican Party about to what extent the governor is focused primarily or principally on re-election, and is there perhaps any tension with other contenders who we may see on the ballot within the Republican Party? So, Stephen, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think definitely if you look at the way things went with the November election on through the January runoff, it was a pretty chaotic time. And there were a lot of things said and done by Republican lawmakers to undermine faith in the election, to support President Trump and his ill-fated attempts to overturn the results in his favor, and things that are leaving lasting impressions with the Republican Party and Republican voters in Georgia. I think you've seen some of it play out more subtly with Governor Kemp and House Speaker David Ralston and Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan trying to really rein in some of the more extreme notions about the Republican Party and Republican lawmakers with some of their actions. And I think, so far, knock on wood, the first quarter of the legislative session has been relatively calm and relatively free of fireworks over controversial bills or controversial floor speeches and the like. And I think it's because you look at the numbers, and Georgia elected a Democrat for president for the first time in nearly 3 decades, and they flipped both U.S. Senate seats and control of the chamber. And I think this new decade in Georgia is going to be different. And the Republican leadership, Kemp especially, recognizes the writing on the wall that Georgia is a state that is probably as purple as they come at the moment. And the types of policies and legacies that they want to use running into 2022 are going to look a lot different than, the 2018 election. And in one regards, you've got Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and others that are going to be facing primary challenges from the right. But also to win a statewide election in Georgia, we've seen that that kind of rightward tack is not the best strategy. And we saw, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, who originally intended to be moderate economy-focused lawmakers, had to run to the right to maintain the support of President Trump and the Republican base, and they ended up losing. And so Kemp, I think, sees the writing on the wall that if he is going to run against Stacey Abrams again, the blowing things up, chainsaw, shotgun, big pickup truck image that he used to bulldoze his way through the primary in 2018 isn't necessarily going to be the message that's going to keep him in the governor's mansion, which is why you're seeing this focus on economic recovery and on coronavirus recovery and things that if you had your eyes closed, you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's a Republican, hard right policy.
And I would just add that, while we talk about policy a lot, and that is what everybody's here to do, right? Politics is always there. There's always tensions and conflict underneath, coming from all different angles, whether that's between parties or amongst them. So, there are some state senators whose names have been thrown out as possible challengers to Governor Kemp and other, statewide elected officials. So it's always there and you're always aware of it. I think that right now, as I said before, and as Stephen was kind of alluding, all eyes are really on Republicans and how they're going to keep themselves together and accomplish the policies that, those who are in charge, namely the speaker, the governor, and lieutenant governor, feel are priorities of the party. And it's probably going to be a little messy. It already is a little bit messy. And it's a purple state.
And sort of on that same notion, to what extent, and I'll throw this question out to Stan, to what extent when it comes to 2022, will Governor Kemp's policies for this session and next year shape perhaps his election recertification? Like the fact that, is it going to be how he handled the coronavirus when it hit last year? Or could there be perhaps a shift? Because we did see Georgia flipping blue already twice, even though Governor Kemp, despite getting some of those attacks from President Trump, never publicly at least talked about anything negative about the former US president. So where is that going to sort of lie, you think, with voters? Are they going to be judging Kemp on what he's already done or what he will do until then, or maybe a combination of the two?
I think the Trump factor is going to be pretty significant. He did get 4 million or so votes, and it was really close here in Georgia. And we see that even though some people do distance themselves within the party from Trump, especially with the election fallout, he still has a considerable base, and he will be backing another candidate in the primary against Kemp. And at that point, I think that'll just be an all-out fight. And I don't know how much policies will play a role in that. I think that may happen if Kemp emerges from the primary and does face Stacey Abrams. Then I think you'll see much more about how did Governor Kemp handle COVID, and how quickly should he have kind of reopened the state, and how's the economy doing? And Kemp will probably point to the hate crimes law, and they do pass a citizens arrest law to say that like you said earlier, more moderate policies. So I think if in the primary for Kemp, if Trump does get involved with it, it's going to get pretty ugly. I don't know what policies Kemp has passed is going to play in that, as much as it is just which side gets out to vote more. But I do think potentially once it gets to the actual general election, and if it is Abrams or someone else, I think Kemp will hopefully we'll try to play that up, and it'll be kind of up to the voters to whether that sways them enough to get out and vote for him.
And same question to either Stephen or Emma, and also sort of adding this sort of notion about the whole mask mandate thing that's sort of come up multiple times with Governor Kemp. He's obviously decided not to do that. Do you think that the election, for 2022, is going to factor in what all happened last year, or will it really be moving Georgia forward between now and next November?
I mean, when I'm thinking about 2022, the pandemic is going to hang over it all, right? And the Democrats are going to take Kemp to task for his handling of it and everything that went wrong. They'll hold him accountable for it. But Governor Kemp's perspective is, look, I was protecting lives and livelihoods. That's been his argument, and I think we've heard him already start to stand by his record and his pandemic response. And I will also add two things on the Trump factor. One is that while President Trump made a really public promise to campaign against Governor Kemp multiple times, nobody seems able to really predict what he does. So who knows? And second of all, now Democrats in a general election can't hammer Kemp in the same way with Trump, because Kemp did stand his ground. He never outwardly criticized the president, but he refused to resign when the president asked him to, and refused to intervene and overturn the election when the president asked him to. So that's a different dynamic for Kemp in a competitive state. And I do, however, think that the pandemic, how can it not? It's really defined our lives so much that I think it will be a big part in the campaign primary level and in general.
And I would just add quickly that I think because of all of this, interestingly enough, I think the statewide elected official who probably is the safest in a Republican primary in 2022 is Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. I think a recent AJC poll came out and said that he actually was the Republican official that had the highest favorability. And I know Democrats don't vote in Republican primaries, but a lot of Democrats support what he does. But I think,
you think Raffensperger is safe in a Republican primary?
I think
I gotta ask that.
I think he may be one of the safer ones, because I think Kemp is a bigger target that may end up drawing more people running against him or running for the open Senate, or for running against Warnock in the 2022 Senate seat. I think those two may be bigger targets that siphon off more of the heat away from the Republicans that think Raffensperger, should be in jail for fraud. It's a hot take for sure, but there's a lot of time. But I do think that with that Senate, with the Senate race being, I know Doug Collins has already floated the idea of running again for that seat, and with maybe some lawmakers running against Kemp for primarying him in 2022, I think Raffensperger may in some way have peaked a little too early, so he avoids the brunt of these primary challenges. Vernon Jones is not going to be a serious primary challenge, and that may be all he has to deal with.
I will just point out, I think it's really interesting how, even though this is a legislative panel, and these are the kinds of conversations that everyone's having down at the legislature too. So I know we've kind of veered into politics in 2022, but unfortunately, this is pretty representative of what a lot of people are talking about at the Capitol too, which is another reason why, I don't know how much beyond election reform we're going to see in terms of controversial legislation, because there's just there's not that much oxygen left after all this.
And as we wrap it up, I can't believe it's already been an hour. It's such an insightful discussion by our esteemed panelists. I want to sort of shift gears and talk about you guys individually as journalists. 2020, the year of the pandemic, the protests, the politics, and who would have thought, right, when we walked in there last year. For you personally, when it came to safety in those conversations, whether it was feeling comfortable going back this session, or covering the protests, or worrying about could there be riots here at the Georgia State Capitol after what we saw in DC, how have those conversations been with you and your newsroom managers, and on a personal level in terms of feeling safe or not feeling threatened? Have you guys had any instances or taken extra precautions, or sort of what is going through your mind? We'll start with Stan first.
Yeah, that's been a big topic among me and my colleagues. And instantly once the pandemic hit, we went from basically working at home once the session got suspended last March, and we worked from home. At one point, we were just coming into the office once a week, kind of just to catch up with everything, just because it made more things conducive. But we resorted to Zoom meetings to say that if you don't need to go out, if you can work from home, make your calls, emails, do everything from there. instead of, going up to our main office downtown or over to the Capitol, stay away from that. And we also had a discussion too about how to kind of handle once the session started back up, whether we felt, safe enough to be around the Capitol. It's, you don't want to stay around there longer than you have to, but I do think the new testing measures, the masks and testing measures, while not perfect, makes it a little bit safer, but still, that is definitely an important, safety is an important topic among my staff, and I know I'm sure every other media outlet is the same way as well.
Emma, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a tweet once, and it sticks in my head because it's like normally when you're covering Republicans and Democrats, you always feel like you're kind of in two worlds where there are different sets of facts and different realities. But this year it's been like two different galaxies. I mean, because Republicans started having in-person events that were sometimes masked, sometimes not over the summer. And Democrats didn't really come back in person and in very spread out, socially distant ways until October. So it was really strange as a reporter, and I'm sure that Stan and Stephen can relate, and it felt very odd. Like I mentioned before, our instinct is to get out there and get in the middle of it. And then you have this other force pulling you back. Should I really do that? But I can't do my job if I don't do that. And so it's been a line we've had to walk. We were classified as essential workers by DHS. And so I took the approach that I would take risks where I thought I could manage my own risk, go to a Republican event that's outside. There were some that were not, and it was kind of intense, but there has been, I think a shift. And even as the campaigns went on and as the runoffs went on, we saw Republicans, I think, change some of their tacks on that. But I mean, it's been crazy for everybody in this pandemic, not just journalists. This was just our little window into it. But yeah, it's been weird. I haven't been able to think too hard about it, because if I think too hard about it, then sometimes I won't go cover the things I need to cover.
Right. It prevents us from doing our job. The only people that run to disasters are first responders and journalists. And Stephen, same question to you on that last note.
Yeah, I mean, it was just strange, in the final week of the November election, you had Obama, Biden, and Trump all come to Georgia. I went to all three of those, and it was just strange to be down in Warm Springs in my own little 6-foot paper circle that the Biden campaign had to keep everyone away. And there was maybe, 36 people there max at this event that he did. And then to go to a Trump campaign rally in Rome where there were 30,000 people packed in, and we were, talking with people that didn't have masks on, that talked about people they knew that had died from the virus, but they weren't going to worry about it and be masked. And it was just, every time I would get tested after covering a big, massive maskless event, it's like, was this something I could watch at home or not? But then, on the elections front, I had people like anonymous Twitter accounts send me screenshots of my parents' home address, calling me a traitor and asking, if I wanted something to happen to my family, or, had people tell me that send me pictures of myself, being perp walked to Guantanamo Bay and, executed for treason and things like that. And it just, a lot of it's anonymous threats and, people just saying extreme things on social media. But I think the combination of the pandemic and everyone kind of being stuck inside at home with one of the most controversial, polarizing elections we've seen, it just, everything puts you on edge when dealing with all of these things. And I think 2020 is definitely a year that I don't want to relive in a lot of regards. I miss being around people and talking with them and having face-to-face conversations and interviews, and not having to worry about a deadly pandemic. And so it's just, it was a rough year, and hopefully things will be better moving forward.
Absolutely. I was going to say, even when it came to the protests, it was one thing watching it on TV and watching it live and realizing this is your city. And normally we would run, and most of us did, but at the risk of wearing a mask and making sure that how can you socially distance in a protest? And this is our job to cover it. And we're out there downtown, all that jazz, and then still worrying about, could I get a virus that could infect me or spread? So at least 2020 is behind us, and hopefully 2021 will be the light and some much needed vaccines and changes. And as we wrap this up, I want to sort of ask, there's a question I love asking. It's the easiest question. Describe 2020 in just 3 words. 3 words to sum up your experience personally, politically, professionally, whatever that is. And I'm going to go in the same order that we've been doing: Stan, Emma, and then we'll go to Stephen, and then I'll toss it back to our president, Christy. So 3 words for 2020.
Oh, let's put me on the spot. The worst ever? I don't,
Never say never, right? Never say never. We don't
yeah,
want to. Emma, what about you?
Oh,
And keep in mind, we're all journalists here. We're supposed to be good with words.
okay, this is 4 words. Whiplash from a distance. Everything felt like it was from a distance, but I just felt like I was constantly being whiplashed everywhere.
Stephen, what about you?
I'm just going to say, thanks, internet. Interpret that as you wish.
Interpret that as we wish. Well, I'm going to hand the reins back to our president of the Atlanta Press Club. Thank you all for tuning in. Of course, this will be recorded, and we'll be uploading this to YouTube, so you can check it out there. And for joining in for any of the future events and becoming a member of the Atlanta Press Club, I've been involved for several years. Highly encourage you to do so. It's a great way to connect with other journalists and folks here in the Atlanta community. Even if you are not in the city of Atlanta, if you're in another part of Georgia, head over to the website, atlantapressclub.org. And with that, it's been a pleasure hosting, and thank you to all of our panelists. I am grateful for your time. A really insightful discussion, and Christy, we'll throw it back to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Archith, and thank you to our great panel. Wonderful discussion. Stan Dunlap, Stephen Fowler, and Emma Hurt. Thank you all for taking the time today to do this. Archith did a great shout out to the Press Club. AtlantaPressClub.org is where you go to sign up, to be a member, join, and check out our events. Like we said, next Wednesday, February 10th, we will have The Future of Democracy Now. So a little bit of a continuation on that final theme that we ended on about 2020 today. We hope everyone has a great and safe weekend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.